July 5, 2014, 1:42 a.m. Chicago, Illinois. According to police records, the first emergency call came in less than 2 hours after Independence Day celebrations ended. What initially sounded like a domestic disturbance would soon unravel into one of the most psychologically disturbing crimes the city had seen in years. Fireworks lit up the Chicago skyline, but somewhere beneath the celebration, a young woman was vanishing. She left a party smiling and was never seen alive again. Who followed her into the dark? And how did a night meant for freedom end in absolute control? By the time the truth emerged, it exposed a terror no one saw coming. July 4, 2014, 11:18 p.m. Chicago, Illinois. According to transit cameras and phone records later collected by detectives, this was the last confirmed hour of movement for the woman at the center of the case. She had spent the evening at a small 4th of July gathering on the city's north side, an unremarkable apartment filled with music, laughter, and the dull haze of alcohol. Witnesses would later describe her as relaxed, smiling easily, her voice occasionally lost beneath the explosions of fireworks outside. The celebration itself offered no warning. Red plastic cups lined the kitchen counter. Someone grilled on a balcony overlooking the street, sending the smell of smoke into the humid summer air. Neighbors leaned from windows to watch bursts of color scatter across the sky. In recorded statements, friends recalled the woman laughing at something trivial, leaning against a doorway, checking her phone only once. Nothing about her behavior suggested fear, urgency, or distress. Shortly after 10:45 p.m., several attendees noticed her gathering her belongings. She hugged 2 people goodbye, thanked the host, and mentioned she had an early morning ahead. Her words were casual, routine, and unmemorable. Later, investigators would return to this moment repeatedly, dissecting it for signs that never existed. No argument preceded her exit. No visible tension lingered in the room as she stepped into the hallway. Security footage from the building shows her leaving alone. She pauses near the entrance, adjusting a strap on her shoulder, then disappears onto the sidewalk. Fireworks continue in the distance, bright flashes reflecting off parked cars. The camera records no one following her, no sudden movement that might have raised suspicion at the time. To anyone watching live, it was an ordinary departure on a holiday night. Cell phone data places her walking south, toward home. At 11:07 p.m., her phone connects briefly to a nearby tower. A final text message is sent to a friend, short and unremarkable, ending with a single emoji. There are no further outgoing calls, no emergency messages, no signal of danger. After that moment, the digital trail grows quiet. By midnight, the party continues without her. Music grows louder, alcohol empties, fireworks reach their peak and then slowly fade. The woman does not return to the apartment, and no one expects her to. She had left before. She had walked home before. On this night, her absence does not yet mean anything. It would take hours for concern to form, days for fear to solidify, and months for the full weight of that night to be understood. Investigators would later mark July 4th as the final page of normalcy in her life, the last time the world saw her as she truly was. What followed would be pieced together slowly, beginning with the silence that greeted the morning. That silence, investigators would later note, was not immediate panic but something more dangerous. Assumption: the city woke beneath discarded flags and empty streets, and no alarm was raised. Her door was never opened that night. Her phone was never checked by anyone else. In those early hours, the absence blended seamlessly into the background of a holiday weekend, allowing time to pass unchecked. By the time questions began forming, the night had already sealed its secrets, and the path she walked after the fireworks ended had become uncertain, fragmented, and vulnerable to whatever waited beyond the reach of cameras and witnesses. That uncertainty would soon draw attention from authorities, who would retrace every minute of the celebration. Starting with the walk home no one believed required concern at the beginning alone. July 4, 2014, between 11:18 p.m. and 11:43 p.m., the city of Chicago continued celebrating while one woman moved quietly through it. Investigators would later reconstruct her route using security footage, transit cameras, and cell tower pings, layering fragments of evidence over the silence left behind. Each data point marked a step forward, but none explained what happened in between. The first camera captures her 3 blocks from the party. She walks alone, shoulders slightly hunched, the echo of fireworks still visible in the sky behind her. Her pace is steady, unhurried. There is no visible sign of fear. A car passes, someone laughs off-screen. The city feels awake, alive, indifferent. At 11:24 p.m., her phone connects to a second tower. Records show no active call, only background data, the device quietly confirming her presence before moving on. Investigators later described this moment as chilling in its normalcy. She was still moving, still safe, still unseen by anyone who might later wish they had noticed. Another camera, mounted above a closed storefront, records her crossing the street. The image quality is poor, grainy, distorted by low light. In the far background, a shape moves briefly into frame. A person, possibly male, possibly nothing at all. The figure never approaches her. It never turns its head. At the time, detectives dismissed it as coincidence, another pedestrian enjoying the night. What the footage does show clearly is isolation. The sidewalk stretches long and empty ahead of her. Storefronts are dark. Fireworks no longer dominate the soundscape. In later interviews, investigators would note how quickly celebration gives way to quiet, how abruptly safety can feel conditional once witnesses disappear. At 11:31 p.m., her phone receives a call from a number saved in her contacts. It rings for 20 seconds. There is no answer. The voicemail inbox remains untouched. Minutes later, a text message arrives. It is never opened. The phone remains active but silent, traveling forward without response. By 11:38 p.m., the final confirmed camera sighting places her near an intersection less than 10 minutes from home. She pauses briefly, as if checking her surroundings or adjusting her grip on her phone. The camera cuts out before she moves again. No struggle is visible. No sudden interruption marks the end of her walk. The last cell tower ping registers at 11:43 p.m. After that, her device goes quiet. No battery drain. No shutdown notification. Simply absence. Investigators would later debate whether the phone was powered off intentionally or destroyed, but in those early hours, the silence had no explanation. In hindsight, every missed call feels heavier, every unread message louder. At the time, none of it triggered alarm. Holidays forgive delays, nights erase urgency. The city slept, unaware that a simple walk had stretched into something endless. By morning, her route would be retraced in reverse, frame by frame, step by step. Detectives would stand where she stood, looking down the same empty sidewalks, trying to understand where certainty ended. Patrol officers would knock on doors, speak to shop owners, and review footage that revealed nothing new. That delay would become critical. Hours passed before anyone questioned her absence, before concern replaced assumption. By then, the night had erased itself. Streets were cleaned. Foot traffic changed. Whatever had happened existed only in fragments, locked inside machines and memory. The case would begin not with a scream or a witness, but with unanswered calls and a growing realization that silence itself was now the loudest evidence. It was already late. By the time dawn broke on July 5, 2014, the unanswered calls had begun to feel heavier. The city woke slowly, streets littered with spent fireworks and paper flags, but one door remained closed. The woman never arrived home. Her phone still went straight to voicemail. At first, the concern was cautious, restrained by logic and habit. She was an adult. She had walked home before. Holiday nights stretched long. By mid-morning, restraint gave way to unease. A family member tried again, calling and texting repeatedly. There was no reply. When they reached out to friends from the party, the answers were casual, almost reassuring. She left early. She said she was tired. She walked out alone. The explanations were consistent enough to delay panic, yet incomplete enough to feed it. At 1:12 p.m., the missing person report was filed. According to police records, the initial intake described no history of running away, no known conflicts, no immediate red flags. Officers classified the case as a welfare concern, routine but necessary. Still, the timing mattered. More than 12 hours had passed since her last confirmed movement. Silence had settled in where routine should have resumed. Detectives assigned to the case began with the obvious. They pulled phone records, reviewed transit footage, and contacted everyone who had seen her that night. The party became the focal point. Statements were collected separately, each witness asked to recount the same evening. At first, the stories aligned. Laughter, fireworks, drinks. A normal night, then small inconsistencies surfaced. One guest recalled her checking her phone frequently. Another insisted she barely looked at it. Someone mentioned she seemed distracted near the end, while others described her as perfectly calm. None of the discrepancies were dramatic, but detectives noted them carefully. In cases like this, contradiction often hid in the mundane. As interviews continued, a name surfaced repeatedly. A person she trusted, someone she spoke to often, sometimes daily. This individual was described as close, dependable, and familiar with her routines. Investigators requested a meeting, framing it as standard procedure. At the time, no one considered this person a suspect. They were simply part of her life. The interview was brief. The confidant appeared cooperative, offering details freely. They confirmed recent conversations, casual plans, nothing out of the ordinary. When asked about the night of July 4th, their answers were calm, measured, almost rehearsed. They claimed no contact after the party, no missed calls, no unresolved tension. Detectives noted the certainty with which these statements were delivered. What remained unsaid was not yet visible. The confidant did not lie outright. They omitted. They framed events in ways that felt safe, incomplete, protective. At the time, officers had no reason to push harder. Without evidence of foul play, the case remained open-ended, driven more by absence than accusation. By late afternoon, patrol officers canvassed the victim's route home. They knocked on doors, spoke to shop owners, and requested access to private cameras. Nothing immediate surfaced. The city had already moved on. Traffic patterns changed. Footage was overwritten. Memory blurred as evening approached. The urgency sharpened. Supervisors elevated the case, assigning additional resources. Detectives gathered around a growing timeline pinned with timestamps and grainy images. The final moments remained stubbornly blank. Somewhere between celebration and mourning, the story fractured before night fell again. Officers prepared to expand their search inward, toward places connected to her life rather than the street she vanished from. Attention shifted from the walk itself to the spaces she trusted. One address, mentioned only in passing during interviews, began to stand out. By the next day, investigators would step inside, unaware that what waited there would change the direction of the case entirely. July 6, 2014, 9:03 a.m. Detectives arrived at a modest apartment building on West Belmont. The address had surfaced quietly during interviews, mentioned only as a place the victim sometimes visited. There was no warrant for arrest, no suspect, only consent to enter and a growing sense that chance was narrowing. The building itself blended into the block, brick worn smooth, by decades of tenants coming and going without consequence. The door opened easily. Inside, the apartment felt wrong before anything specific came into focus. Furniture sat slightly out of place, as if pushed and returned too quickly. A chair angled away from the table. A couch cushion flipped. Nothing was broken, nothing screamed violence. Yet the room carried tension, the kind that lingers after something has been interrupted and never properly finished. Detectives noted a faint chemical smell, sharp and misplaced among ordinary household scents. Cleaning products were visible, lined neatly beneath the sink, their caps tightened with care. On the living room floor, a darker patch in the carpet suggested recent attention. It had been scrubbed hard, fibers roughened, moisture still trapped deep within where the surface could no longer hide it completely. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no bloodstains visible to the naked eye. But absence can mislead, and investigators knew it. They photographed everything, measuring distances, documenting angles, preserving the quiet details most people overlook. A trash bag by the door contained paper towels, damp and discolored, twisted together, as if thrown away in a hurry. The apartment's occupant was not present. He had agreed to meet later, according to officers, and had provided access without hesitation. At this stage, detectives described him only as cooperative, someone tangentially connected to the victim's life. His name appeared in phone records. His address appeared in conversation. No conclusions were drawn, but attention lingered longer than before. Still, the scene shifted the investigation. Until that moment, the disappearance had been treated as uncertain, possibly voluntary. Standing inside the apartment, that theory weakened. The space felt prepared, adjusted, as if someone had anticipated scrutiny and attempted to erase its traces without fully understanding what could remain behind. For the first time, detectives considered intent. If something happened here, it was not random. The order, the cleaning, the absence of chaos suggested control. That realization reframed every earlier assumption. The walk home was no longer the only focus. The danger may not have waited on the street at all as officers exited, evidence bags sealed. They exchanged few words. Outside, traffic moved steadily, unaware. The building looked ordinary, forgettable, like hundreds of others. Inside, questions multiplied. Who had been here when? And why had no one noticed sooner? By the end of the morning, attention turned inevitably toward the man who lived there. Detectives prepared for a formal interview, armed now with unease instead of theory. The confidant's earlier words replayed differently. Cooperation no longer equaled clarity. As timelines were reviewed and assumptions stripped away, one fact settled in with certainty. The disappearance had left the street and entered a private space. Whatever came next would depend on what he chose to reveal, and what he might still be hiding when questioned. July 6, 2014, 4:27 p.m. Detectives sat across from the man whose apartment on West Belmont had quietly altered the course of the investigation. He arrived on time, dressed neatly, posture relaxed, hands folded as if this were an inconvenience rather than a crisis. From the start, his calm stood in contrast to the urgency surrounding the missing woman. Phone records placed him firmly within her recent life. Calls stretched back weeks, sometimes daily, sometimes late at night. Texts were frequent, familiar, intimate in tone without being explicit. When detectives asked about the nature of their relationship, he described it carefully. They were friends, he said, confidants, nothing more. His voice remained steady, his expressions controlled. He acknowledged speaking with her earlier that week, mentioning stress, fatigue, ordinary problems. When asked about July 4th, he paused only briefly before answering. He had not seen her that night, had not expected to. He spent the evening alone, he claimed, watching fireworks from his window before going to bed. The timeline sounded plausible. Too plausible. As the interview continued, subtle fractures appeared. He first stated their last conversation occurred days before the party. Minutes later, he referenced a message sent the morning of July 4th. When corrected gently, he adjusted without resistance, smiling faintly as if the distinction did not matter. Detectives noted the ease with which he reframed details. His language revealed patterns. He spoke often about her emotions, her dependency, her tendency to overthink. He framed himself as stabilizing, reassuring, necessary. Yet when asked why she trusted him so deeply, he deflected, saying she misread things sometimes. Control hid beneath concern, visible only in hindsight. When questioned about the apartment, he appeared unfazed. Yes, she had been there before. Occasionally. Nothing unusual. The chemical smell, the cleaning, the displaced furniture were dismissed as routine maintenance. He offered explanations before they were requested, anticipating suspicion while maintaining innocence. Investigators listened, allowing silence to do its work. At one point, a detective mentioned the unread text message sent to her phone late that night. The man's eyes flickered briefly, a fraction of a second too long. He denied sending it. Records would later confirm he had. At the time, the contradiction stood alone, small but undeniable. Despite inconsistencies, there was no confession, no overt threat, no direct evidence tying him to a crime. He was released after the interview, labeled a person of interest rather than a suspect. Yet as he left the room, detectives shared a look of shared unease. He knew details he should not have known. He anticipated questions he had not been asked. That evening, investigators returned to the timeline. They replayed the interview audio, isolating moments where certainty wavered. Patterns emerged, subtle but persistent. The man positioned himself close to the center of her life while insisting on distance. He minimized her autonomy while denying responsibility. By nightfall, detectives requested deeper forensic analysis of the apartment. Luminol tests were authorized. Digital evidence was flagged for review. The case had shifted again, tightening its focus. What began as a disappearance now hinted at something carefully managed, quietly controlled. In the hours that followed, Search teams prepared for possibilities investigators had avoided naming aloud. Missing persons cases often ended quietly, with explanations that softened fear. This one refused to settle. Every record, every pause, every measured response from the man suggested preparation rather than surprise. Detectives understood then that whatever had happened was not impulsive. It had been shaped, rehearsed, and concealed. Attention now turned to the physical evidence itself, because spaces remember what people try to erase. Fibers, residues, and traces ignored by the eye often survive in tension, waiting patiently for light. Soon, that light would be switched on. Inside, quietly as forensic teams prepared to re-enter the apartment on West Belmont, detectives widened the investigation outward, turning to the people who knew the victim best. The calls began quietly, framed as routine follow-ups. Friends were asked to recount recent conversations, moods, changes. At first, the answers sounded familiar, almost protective. She was busy, tired, under stress from work. Nothing alarming. Then the tone shifted. One friend hesitated before speaking, lowering her voice even though no one else was in the room. She admitted there had been someone in the victim's life, a relationship rarely mentioned and never explained in full. It was not public, it was not simple. The victim had described it once as complicated, then refused to elaborate. At the time, no one pushed. More friends came forward, each offering fragments, late-night calls, sudden cancellations, emotional highs followed by visible exhaustion. The victim had begun second-guessing herself, apologizing for things that required no apology. She asked questions that sounded like doubt rather than curiosity. Am I overreacting? Am I imagining this? Those questions lingered now, heavy with implication. Investigators listened as a pattern emerged. The man from West Belmont was not just present in her life. He was central, influential. He positioned himself as her anchor during moments of vulnerability, reinforcing dependence while discouraging outside perspective. Friends recalled how she defended him reflexively, even when his behavior unsettled her. She insisted he understood her better than anyone else. In the weeks before her disappearance, the victim's fear had sharpened. One friend described a conversation where the victim admitted feeling trapped, unable to step away without consequences she could not articulate. She worried about his reactions, his moods, his expectations. Yet she also feared losing the sense of validation he provided. The contradiction exhausted her. Secrecy became a shield and a cage. By hiding the relationship, she limited interference, but also isolated herself. The fewer people who knew, the easier it became to question her own instincts. Investigators recognized the pattern immediately. Control does not always announce itself through violence. Often, it arrives disguised as care, as protection, as emotional necessity. Text messages recovered from her phone reinforced the accounts. Though incomplete, they revealed imbalance. His messages were directive, corrective, framed as concern. Hers were tentative, seeking reassurance, apologizing for imagined faults. When detectives mapped the exchange frequency, spikes aligned with moments. Friends remembered her withdrawing socially. None of the friends believed he was capable of harming her. That belief had protected him, and perhaps delayed intervention. Even now, their voices carried disbelief alongside guilt. They wondered aloud whether they should have insisted, confronted, intervened. Investigators noted the same regret repeatedly. Warning signs are clearer only after they fail. As the interviews concluded, detectives added a new dimension to the timeline. The disappearance was no longer a sudden event interrupting a normal life. It was the culmination of mounting pressure, of emotional erosion unfolding privately. The night of July 4th did not stand alone. It followed weeks of instability carefully hidden behind routine. By evening, the case had acquired weight. Not just the weight of loss, but of intent. Obsession, when left unchecked, reshapes boundaries. Power imbalance distorts perception. Secrecy narrows options until escape feels impossible. Investigators now understood that whatever happened next was unlikely to have been spontaneous. That understanding sharpened urgency. Forensic teams were instructed to look deeper, to treat the apartment as a space shaped by prolonged interaction rather than a single moment. Attention turned to what might remain beneath surfaces scrubbed too carefully, to what technology could reveal that people would not say behind closed doors. Truth accumulates slowly, pressing outward until it demands recognition. The victim's life, once compartmentalized, was now being reassembled in full. And as each hidden detail surfaced, detectives moved closer to confronting the physical reality of what secrecy had enabled. Evidence that would soon speak where people had stayed silent. July 8, 2014, 6:14 a.m. A jogger discovered what appeared at first to be debris near an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city. Police responded quickly, cordoning off the area. Among broken bottles and scattered trash, human remains were visible, fragmented, partially concealed by overgrown weeds. The discovery transformed the case overnight. What had been a missing person report became a full-scale investigation into a death that demanded explanation. By mid-morning, forensic teams were on site, carefully documenting the scene. Evidence markers were placed around bones, personal effects, and fragments of clothing. Nothing suggested a struggle in the open. No defensive injuries were immediately apparent. Yet the body's positioning, the subtle disturbances of the surrounding environment, and the deliberate concealment indicated planning. Investigators understood immediately that this was not random, nor opportunistic. Identification took time. Dental records matched the victim conclusively. Relief that the woman was found was overshadowed by horror at the confirmation. Every investigator in the room absorbed the weight of that knowledge. The reality of death, previously abstract, now demanded action. They began retracing the final steps of her life with renewed urgency, the timeline once speculative now anchored to a definitive outcome. The autopsy revealed more than cause of death. Trauma analysis indicated asphyxiation as the immediate factor, but patterns of prolonged stress emerged. Bruising consistent with restraint, repeated small abrasions, and signs of psychological manipulation suggested captivity or coercion in the days leading up to her death. Toxicology confirmed elevated stress indicators, and the presence of alcohol consistent with consumption on July 4th. Investigators concluded that her final night had been influenced not only by physical danger, but by sustained emotional control. Coroners noted evidence of ongoing fear. Bruises hidden under clothing, hair torn in moments of resistance, fingernail marks indicating attempts to escape. These indicators were subtle but cumulatively persuasive. The victim had struggled psychologically and physically, a combination that painted a portrait of prolonged manipulation and isolation. It was no longer possible to see the disappearance as voluntary. Control had been exerted deliberately. Detectives re-examined interviews from friends, the confidant, and the man from West Belmont. The inconsistencies in statements, once minor, now aligned with the autopsy findings. Text messages revealed her increasing anxiety, her hesitation to assert herself, and her repeated attempts to rationalize threatening behavior. Each fragment corroborated the conclusion that she had been trapped not only in a physical sense, but emotionally, guided into vulnerability by someone she trusted. Evidence collected from her phone, the apartment, and her social contacts was cross-referenced with the forensic findings. Investigators mapped patterns, late-night calls from someone controlling her movements, texts that admonished yet comforted, and gaps in location data where surveillance failed. The victim's autonomy had been slowly diminished, her decisions influenced by the unseen pressure of another. Every detail supported the grim conclusion. This was a targeted crime, executed through control as much as physical action. Public awareness followed soon after the identification. Families were notified, and news outlets reported the discovery cautiously. Law enforcement emphasized that while the scene was disturbing, premature conclusions could mislead the public. Investigators remained focused on evidence, piecing together a story that unfolded across digital traces, physical spaces, and psychological indicators. By the afternoon, the narrative shifted entirely. The missing person report became a murder investigation. Detectives framed questions differently. Who had the opportunity? Who had knowledge? Who had influence over her final hours? Every lead, every inconsistency gained weight. The man previously interviewed emerged as a critical figure in the case, not merely tangential but central. As the day ended, the team reviewed every recorded movement of the victim. Security footage, call logs, witness accounts, all were scrutinized for alignment with the autopsy findings. A clear picture of calculated control began to emerge. The case was no longer about locating a missing woman. It was about reconstructing a carefully orchestrated crime. Investigators concluded that the night of July 4th had been the final link in a chain of manipulation that stretched back weeks. Every moment of silence, every unread message, every step along her walk home contributed to a pattern. The physical evidence now reinforced the psychological portrait. A life constrained, decisions influenced, and autonomy stripped away by evening. A decision was made to focus on the man who had remained calm throughout prior interviews. He was no longer merely a person of interest. He had knowledge, proximity, and potential motive. The investigation would pivot from reconstruction to confrontation, preparing to challenge the control that had defined her final days. The body, silent yet eloquent, had revealed the truth investigators had suspected. This was no accident. It was a crime of calculation, executed with precision, and the next step demanded that someone accountable be faced with evidence that could not be ignored. July 9, 2014, 10:18 a.m. The suspect returned to the interrogation room under renewed questioning. Detectives approached with a revised strategy, informed by forensic evidence, witness statements, and the autopsy report. The calm, composed demeanor he had displayed in prior interviews was gone, or at least fractured. His hands, once folded neatly, now tapped lightly on the table. Eyes darted occasionally to the mirrored wall, seeking reassurance. The session began quietly, with procedural questions about his movements on July 4th. At first, he responded with the same tone of casual certainty. He claimed to have been alone, watching fireworks, unaware of the victim's departure from the party. Each statement was concise, measured, rehearsed. Detectives let him talk, allowing silence to punctuate his words, as they had noticed previously that pauses tended to reveal cracks. It didn't take long. The first fissure appeared when a detective asked about the chemical residue and disordered furniture found in his apartment. His voice rose slightly, irritation mingling with an almost imperceptible tremor. "That's ridiculous. You're reading too much into cleaning," he snapped. The calm authority had shifted to defensiveness. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk attempting to mask discomfort. As questioning continued, emotional volatility became apparent. When confronted with her final text messages, he hesitated, swallowing audibly before insisting, "I didn't see those. I had nothing to do with any of it." Yet his eyes betrayed uncertainty, lingering on the conversation log displayed on the table. Every denial carried a flicker of agitation, a hesitation that investigators noted meticulously. Detectives pressed on, asking about their relationship, about influence and control. He shifted uncomfortably, recounting moments of concern and guidance, but the narrative wavered. He claimed he had only wanted to help her, framing involvement as supportive rather than controlling. In tone, in expression, in timing, he revealed tension between self-perception and reality. A breakthrough occurred when he was asked about her emotional state in the weeks prior to disappearance. His voice cracked unexpectedly, grief surfacing inappropriately, almost performatively. She was fine. She never seemed afraid," he stammered before immediately correcting himself with a sharp, "I mean, she was happy. She was just fine." The contradiction drew the detective's attention. Veiled threats emerged subtly. When questioned about her movements on July 4th, he leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "If people keep suggesting I'm involved, well, it can get complicated," he said quietly, the words measured but menacing in context. It was not a confession, not yet, but the undertone implied awareness, ownership, and danger. Throughout the session, the suspect's attempts to control the narrative clashed with rising tension. Body language betrayed him. Shoulders stiffened, hands fidgeted, and moments of silence stretched into uncomfortable stretches. Detectives allowed him to speak, recording every inflection, every slip. Each misstep, each self-correction added weight to the investigation. By afternoon, the team had amassed hours of recorded dialogue. Patterns emerged. Defensiveness followed by rationalization, grief performed then retracted, threats disguised as caution. The mask of composure was cracking. What had once appeared as confidence now suggested manipulation layered with anxiety. Investigators reviewed prior interviews, noting differences. Statements made before the body was found now clashed with the emotional reactions in the room. Calm had been replaced by tension, certainty by hesitation. His controlled exterior could no longer contain the pressure applied by evidence and scrutiny. As the session concluded, detectives left the room with a sense of anticipation. The psychological unraveling they had observed suggested that the suspect was no longer in full control. The next phase of the investigation would capitalize on these cracks, drawing him further into confrontation. Each verbal misstep, each fleeting display of vulnerability brought them closer to uncovering the truth. The stage was set. The evidence was no longer abstract. The mask had fractures. And as night fell over Chicago, detectives knew that when he returned for questioning again, the subtle tensions would only intensify. Revealing more of the reality hidden beneath the composure, he had carefully maintained July 9, 2014, 10:18 a.m. The suspect returned to the interrogation room under renewed questioning. Detectives approached with a revised strategy, informed by forensic evidence, witness statements, and the autopsy report. The calm, composed demeanor he had displayed in prior interviews was gone, or at least fractured. His hands, once folded neatly, now tapped lightly on the table. Eyes darted occasionally to the mirrored wall, seeking reassurance. The session began quietly with procedural questions about his movements on July 4th. At first, he responded with the same tone of casual certainty. He claimed to have been alone, watching fireworks, unaware of the victim's departure from the party. Each statement was concise, measured, rehearsed. Detectives let him talk, allowing silence to punctuate his words, as they had noticed previously that pauses tended to reveal cracks. It didn't take long. The first fissure appeared when a detective asked about the chemical residue and disordered furniture found in his apartment. His voice rose slightly, irritation mingling with an almost imperceptible tremor. "That's ridiculous. You're reading too much into cleaning," he snapped. The calm authority had shifted to defensiveness. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk attempting to mask discomfort. As questioning continued, emotional volatility became apparent. When confronted with her final text messages, he hesitated, swallowing audibly before insisting, "I didn't see those. I had nothing to do with any of it." Yet his eyes betrayed uncertainty, lingering on the conversation log displayed on the table. Every denial carried a flicker of agitation, a hesitation that investigators noted meticulously. Detectives pressed on, asking about their relationship, about influence and control. He shifted uncomfortably, recounting moments of concern and guidance, but the narrative wavered. He claimed he had only wanted to help her, framing involvement as supportive rather than controlling. In tone, in expression, in timing, he revealed tension between self-perception and reality. A breakthrough occurred when he was asked about her emotional state in the weeks prior to disappearance. His voice cracked unexpectedly, grief surfacing inappropriately, almost performatively. She was fine. She never seemed afraid," he stammered before immediately correcting himself with a sharp, "I mean, she was happy. She was just fine." The contradiction drew the detective's attention. Veiled threats emerged subtly. When questioned about her movements on July 4th, he leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "If people keep suggesting I'm involved, well, it can get complicated," he said quietly, the words measured but menacing in context. It was not a confession, not yet, but the undertone implied awareness, ownership, and danger. Throughout the session, the suspect's attempts to control the narrative clashed with rising tension. Body language betrayed him. Shoulders stiffened, hands fidgeted, and moments of silence stretched into uncomfortable stretches. Detectives allowed him to speak, recording every inflection, every slip. Each misstep, each self-correction added weight to the investigation. By afternoon, the team had amassed hours of recorded dialogue. Patterns emerged. Defensiveness followed by rationalization, grief performed then retracted, threats disguised as caution. The mask of composure was cracking. What had once appeared as confidence now suggested manipulation layered with anxiety. Investigators reviewed prior interviews, noting differences. Statements made before the body was found now clashed with the emotional reactions in the room. Calm had been replaced by tension, certainty by hesitation. His controlled exterior could no longer contain the pressure applied by evidence and scrutiny. As the session concluded, detectives left the room with a sense of anticipation. The psychological unraveling they had observed suggested that the suspect was no longer in full control. The next phase of the investigation would capitalize on these cracks, drawing him further into confrontation. Each verbal misstep, each fleeting display of vulnerability brought them closer to uncovering the truth. The stage was set. The evidence was no longer abstract. The mask had fractures. And as night fell over Chicago, detectives knew that when he returned for questioning again, the subtle tensions would only intensify. Revealing more of the reality hidden beneath the composure, he had carefully maintained March 3, 2015, 9:02 a.m., Cook County Courtroom 7B. The trial opened with a quiet murmur, the weight of months of investigation hanging in the air. 12 jurors took their seats, faces attentive but uncertain. Prosecutors presented the case carefully, emphasizing both forensic evidence and psychological analysis. The courtroom, sterile yet tense, became the stage where the victim's story would finally find a voice. Opening statements framed the narrative as more than a simple crime. The prosecution described a calculated exertion of control, a relationship defined by manipulation and dependency. Evidence collected from phone logs, security cameras, and the West Belmont apartment was presented in chronological order. Every minor inconsistency, every unread message, every subtle behavioral cue became proof of intent. Constructing a portrait of coercion, witnesses were called one by one. Friends and confidants described her fears, her hesitation, her growing isolation. Their testimonies were precise, emotionally charged, and at times painful to hear aloud. Small details, the way she apologized unnecessarily, the way she sought reassurance constantly, the subtle withdrawal from social life, revealed a life constrained by influence. Jurors leaned forward, absorbing the contrast between the woman they saw in messages and journals, and the cheerful figure glimpsed in photographs from the party. Digital evidence played a central role. Messages were read aloud in court, some displayed on monitors for jurors to see. Her voice emerged in fragments. Uncertainty, apology, attempts to rationalize control disguised as care. Investigators had reconstructed these exchanges to allow the victim to narrate her experience posthumously. Each word, carefully contextualized, drew emotional responses from the jury, and attendees alike. Experts testified about psychological manipulation, power dynamics, and coercive control. Their explanations framed the crime not as impulsive but deliberate, a culmination of weeks of subtle dominance. They described how emotional abuse can shape decisions, restrict autonomy, and create fear that is invisible to outsiders. The jury, attentive and silent, absorbed the technical terminology, but also the human tragedy behind it. The defense challenged interpretations. They argued ambiguity, denied direct involvement, and framed prior statements as misreadings or exaggerations. Yet contradictions from interviews and digital evidence persisted. Small admissions, previously brushed aside, now carried significance. Jurors were forced to weigh subjective interpretations alongside objective records, navigating the fragile balance between law and lived experience. Personal artifacts added weight to the prosecution's case. Journals recovered from her apartment detailed worry, anxiety, and a growing sense of entrapment. Photographs from the party, juxtaposed with later messages, illustrated a life divided, moments of carefree normalcy overlaying a pattern of control. Every visual and textual fragment reinforced the emotional reality of her final weeks. Testimony from investigators emphasized timing, sequence, and intention. Each decision made, each interaction, was mapped meticulously. The courtroom became a reconstructive space, piecing together what had occurred from traces left behind. The emotional toll was evident. Detectives spoke of sleepless nights, the weight of piecing together a life cut short, and the ethical responsibility of presenting truth without distortion. As the trial proceeded, it became clear that the cost of truth extended beyond the legal process. Families relived fear and uncertainty. Friends confronted guilt and regret. The defendant, now visibly strained, grappled with inconsistencies and revelations that eroded composure. Justice was not simple. It demanded reckoning with complexity, ambiguity, and human frailty. By evening, The jury had absorbed evidence of manipulation, coercion, and the psychological toll exacted by control. The victim's voice, reconstructed through messages, journals, and memories, had guided them toward understanding. 12 jurors, once strangers, now shared fragments of a painful truth. The crime was deliberate, personal, and devastating. The next step, deliberation, would determine whether the law could match the gravity of human experience, and whether accountability would finally be assigned where it belonged. April 15, 2015, 10:47 a.m., the courtroom was nearly silent. The verdict had been read, guilty on multiple counts, including first-degree murder and unlawful restraint. The suspect, once composed and guarded, now slumped slightly in the defendant's chair, face pale, hands trembling subtly. For detectives, prosecutors, and the victim's family, the sentence marked closure. But the emotional aftermath remained far from resolved. The judge's words echoed slowly in the chamber. The law had been satisfied, but justice, they reminded all present, extended beyond formal verdicts. Families absorbed the weight of months of investigation, autopsy reports, and testimony, understanding the cost of what had been lost. Friends sat quietly, recalling moments they wished they had acted differently, moments where subtle signals were ignored or rationalized away. Each remembered smile, each casual message, now tinged with tragic significance outside the courtroom. Investigators reflected on the timeline that had unfolded over months. The warning signs had been small, almost invisible to those untrained in observation. Unanswered texts, canceled plans, hesitant phone calls, a growing dependence on one person for reassurance. In retrospect, the patterns were clear. Yet during the celebratory chaos of July 4th, those signals were masked by laughter, fireworks, and the illusion of normalcy. Life's distractions, mundane and joyful, had obscured the subtle encroachment of danger. The sentencing emphasized accountability, not vengeance. The suspect would spend decades in prison, but the chapters of life already written for the victim could never be rewritten. Investigators considered the case's broader implications. Coercion often precedes violence, emotional manipulation can escalate unnoticed, and secrecy can hide peril in plain sight. Knowledge and vigilance, they concluded, are critical in preventing tragedy. Even when appearances suggest nothing is wrong, public awareness campaigns followed, using the case as a cautionary tale. Experts explained how relationships built on dependency and control often appear normal until it is too late. Resources were offered to help recognize subtle signs. Abrupt withdrawal, inconsistent explanations, heightened apologies, and isolation from support networks. The case became a reference for understanding psychological abuse alongside physical evidence, highlighting the ways in which danger can silently infiltrate everyday life. For the victim's family, grief remained acute. They carried the knowledge of her final hours, replayed events in their minds, and revisited memories of her laughter on that 4th of July night. The sentence could not restore the life that was lost, nor erase the fear she must have endured. Friends grappled with regret, but also with a renewed commitment to noticing, questioning, and intervening when small details suggest harm might be possible. Detectives reviewed the lessons learned throughout the investigation. From initial phone pings to security footage, from witness accounts to forensic analysis, each step underscored the importance of persistence, attention to detail, and the ability to read human behavior beyond appearances. In every procedural review, the same conclusion emerged. Vigilance saves lives, and assumption delays accountability. In the quiet aftermath, the city returned to its routines, but the story remained a shadow over familiar streets. Celebrations continued, fireworks still lit the skyline, and people moved through evenings unaware of hidden dangers. Yet for those who followed the case, the 4th of July no longer felt entirely safe. It had become a reminder that joy can coexist with risk, and that subtle threats often reside unnoticed among ordinary moments. The courtroom emptied. The law had acted, yet the human consequences persisted. The cost of ignoring warning signs, the fragility of trust, and the insidious nature of manipulation were clear for all who had witnessed the process. Life, investigators reflected, is not only measured by what is lost, but by the vigilance exercised to protect it. As dusk settled, the city's fireworks faded, leaving quiet streets, reminders of a celebration that ended in terror. The lesson endured. Moral choices, responsibility, and attentiveness to subtle danger are not optional, they are essential. Once lines are crossed, consequences are irreversible. The firework bursts may fade, but their shadows linger, warning that awareness can be the difference between safety and tragedy. This case serves as a reminder that crime rarely begins with violence. It often starts with secrecy, manipulation, and silence. Real justice carries a cost, and awareness can be the difference between safety and tragedy. Choices matter, and once crossed, some lines can never be undone.